This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today's video is going to be concerning the issue of rabbis overruling Hashem. Are the missionaries right? Now, where this comes from is, this one particular missionary that you see here. It comes from a video he did that what you see at the top, but it's kind of like a general overview of things that he says, as well as other missionaries says, because it seems to be something that's kind of a constant within the missionary claim. And what that is that they pretend almost as if to say that, like, well, the rabbis have stolen, either if you want to say Judaism, if you want to say the legitimacy of the Torah itself, they've stolen that, and that it's like the rabbis are on one side, the Jewish people are somewhere in the middle, and then the missionaries are coming to save the Jewish people from the rabbis. Where I kind of take a different stance on this. I take a stance that really it's not just a matter of them saying the rabbis have overruled, as he says in his video here, rabbis overruled God. It's a kind of a claim where he's saying Jews as a whole believe that they can overrule God, and Jews as a whole, are basically, imposters, to the Torah, imposters, if you will, to doing the will of the Creator of all things. And in this video, what I'm going to address is that this one particular issue that is brought up concerning this thing, because as I've shown in other videos, when you really break down, the claims, when you get past kind of the imagery that they portray, for example, like you see in this picture that he's presenting, at the core of it, one of the things he tries to claim in his video is that some of the things in the Talmud are there in order to try to, if you will, um, be as an against to like Jesus, for example, as a way to try to like, as if like the rabbis are so threatened by Jesus and the Jesus movement that they had to come up with things that kind of, made it impossible for any Jew to believe in the concept of Jesus. Now, if you've watched any of my videos, you've seen that I deal with a lot of history of, the New Testament, a lot of history and linguistics and language of it, as well as the history of the original Jewish movement. And as we've seen before, essentially the original Jewish Christians died out on their own within 2 generations of their start. And even Christian sources, claim that the original Jewish Christians that were left went into Jordan and became like heretics to the Christian faith there. So, to really deal with that issue, I think that this video will help really show and shine light on the falsehoods of these claims. And I'm a firm believer, if you're a Christian, you don't have to take any, you don't have to believe anything I'm saying. You can believe the missionaries all you want. But one of the things I'm going to get at in this is that if you don't know Hebrew, and if you don't know Aramaic, and if you don't know the Talmud, you've never read it for yourself, and you have someone explaining these little things to you, especially with this idea, like it says in his top video, why Christians should care. You need to be able to look at this, like I would say, from a whole perspective, and look at both sides and say for yourself, whether you believe it. And to be quite honest, even if you don't, if you say the Jews are wrong, wrong in this, Judaism will still keep going, and Jews will exist the same way we have. But then you also have to go back and ask, okay, what happened to the original Jewish Christians? If they were so right, why did they disappear so quickly? Without any known descendants of theirs continuing and any people that can be named. So now let's get into this issue of what it is that seems to be a big thing that missionaries try to pull out to make this point that rabbis, or is, if you will, really what they're really saying is Jews believe that we can overrule the Creator of all things. So the main story that seems to be one of the things that a lot of them go to is a story in the Talmud, which you could, if you want to like kind of summarize it, you can call it the oven of Achinai or Achinai, and I just say like I'll call it the Oven of Achanai dilemma. And essentially, to explain what this gets at, for example, is the issue of Achinai is dealing with a basically a judicial setting within the land of in the land of Israel and Jerusalem. And what you essentially have is a situation where a particular oven that has been created, essentially there's a question of whether or not it carries ritual impurity, like a tumah, whether it can be considered to have like be affected by it or not. So the thing is the question could be, okay, well, one question I think some people don't ask is why is this issue called Achanai? Why is it called the Oven of Achanai? And one of the reasons that is, if you look at the structure of it, it kind of goes in a circular like fashion. So one of the explanations for it is that the oven is called because it kind of is similar to a snake, in the way that it looks, because a snake that's curled up, for example, and that's one of the reasons that the name is used in this particular setting. And I think that's something that often isn't discussed because that's one of the important issues concerning its structure, how it's made, and considering the question of whether or not carries ritual impurity, which is an important thing to know, especially when you're dealing with the temple. Because, for example, Jews aren't allowed to go to the temple in a situation where we're ritually impure, or ritual impurity. And the word impurity is not the best word to use to translate tuma, or tameh, but it's the best that I have for like most people would probably be watching this video and hearing it in English. So, what you have is that, this issue comes up in front of the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court in the land of Israel during the Second Temple period, generally. And this issue comes up, concerning this oven. And one of the things that, you have to ask yourself is, as you're listening to me telling you some issues about this story and confronting, exactly what the falsehoods that the missionaries claim about is, there's several things I would say are important to discuss. One, can Jewish courts overrule Hashem? That's going to be a question because of the fact that this is something brought up by missionaries. Another question is, does the Torah require miracles in judicial settings? And then another issue is, what is the real point of the story to begin with? And then another issue is the story historical or is it Agadah? When I say Agadah, what I mean is that there are stories that are told, in Jewish texts that are not considered to be historically, as if they historically happened, but more of they're there to try to make a metaphorical point or an allegory of something else. So when you hear this whole story, one of the things I want to have you have these questions in the back of your mind. I want you to have these issues considered because it'll be important when I start discussing some of the falsehoods that I say that the missionaries make about this particular story. So let's first of all have a foundation from the Torah of exactly how the judicial system is supposed to work according to the Torah. Because again, we know the Torah is not just some religious text. That, essentially what it establishes is that the Jewish people are supposed to go to the land of Israel and it's supposed to set up a circumstance where there is a kingdom that has a social structure, a judicial structure, and also, if you will, using modern terms, religious structure that all revolves around the Torah and, the service to the Creator of all things. So it's not just some situation like with most religions where you can kind of believe whatever you want, wherever you want in the world, where the Torah requires the Jewish people do certain things in order to maintain ourselves in the land of Israel, or certain actions lead to exile, which we are currently still in, even though some of us, like me, we live in the land of Israel. So let's, look at what the Torah says about the judicial area of this. Okay, so one of the first starting points we want to get into is a part of the Torah which is called Devarim, Deuteronomy 16:18. And what it says here, and I've covered this in other videos, but we'll cover it again here, and I'll have my marker come on so you can kind of see where I'm going. So it says in Hebrew, Shoftim v'shotorim, titen lecho b'chol she'orecho, asher Adonai Elohecho noten lecho, lishvotecho, v'shofatu et ha'om, mishpat sadak. So translating it says, judges and officers, give to yourself in all your gates, which the Creator of all things, Hashem, has given to you to make judgments, to be judges, to make judgments, and they'll judge, or if you will, lead, the people, and they'll have like the correct, like mishpat. So when we look at this, we can get several things from this. The judges and officers are democratically chosen by the Israeli/Jewish people, and this has always been the case. The judges, they judge cases based on normal human reasoning. Meaning that, there's nowhere in the Torah that tells a judge, to be able to like wait for some miraculous sign in order to make a judgment. If you look at all the descriptions in the Torah, which we'll cover some more of them, they only talk about them having the knowledge and the basis in the Torah to make judgments, but it never talks about having to wait for like signs and wonders to happen in order to make a judgment in a judicial setting in the land of Israel. So the next thing we want to look at is Deuteronomy 17:8 through 10. Devarim 17:8 through 10. And it says, Ki yipale mimecho levor lemishpot, ben dom ledom, ben din lodin, uven nere lo nere, divrei rivot bishwarecho. Wagamto wa'olitho al hamagom, asher yivhar Adonai Elohecho ben, ubotho al hakohanim halawiyim, wa'al hashofet, asher yiyeh bayomim hohem. ודורשתו והגידו לכו את דבר המשפט ועשיתו על פי הדבר אשר יגידו לכו מן המקום ההוא אשר יבחר אדוני ושמרתו לעשות ככל אשר יורוכו. So translating, what does this say? If there's a matter that becomes like, if you will, a big thing or something that is not clear, kind of like it's like saying you're almost like amazed by it, but it's like saying if there's a big issue that comes up in the area of, mishpat, which deals with a judicial setting, whether it be a matter of like, blood, whether it be a matter of judgments, whether it be a matter of, like whether something was touched, like different arguments, amongst in your gates, meaning the Jewish people, the Israeli people in our gates. And it says, and translating this would mean that, like, let's say I'm living in the northern part of Israel, and I have an issue that comes up between me and another person or a group of people or any issue that comes up, and I go, for example, to the local judicial authorities, and they can't they can't come to a conclusion on a judgment, or they don't know something because, it's a matter that's kind of beyond them. Maybe it never came up before. Maybe it involves technologies that, they're not familiar with. And it says that, when that happens, we're supposed to go up to the place that the Creator of all things chose, meaning the Jerusalem, where the temple is, and where the what's called the Sanhedrin is, and it's made up of, different types of Israeli leaders. And it says that we will go to the Kohanim, the people who are the descendants of Aaron, to the Leviim, the people of the tribe of Levi, and also to the Shofet, the judge. So it says that, you have three different types of people who make up the Sanhedrin. You have the Kohanim who are part of it, the Leviim who are part of it, and you have a Shofet who is just a regular, Jew who's not from the tribe of Levi at all. And it says that that's where we'll go in those days. So anytime that this exists, that's where we go to settle these matters that are like big issues, for example, and that, the local authorities can't, or don't understand or address, or, there's a question about it. It's like saying we go to the Supreme Court when all else fails, when questions come up and we can't, come to a resolution through all the other courts. We go to the Supreme Court in Jerusalem, in the land of Israel. And it says that we will go and basically present, if you will, this case to, the this issue of like judicial rulings, to this body and, the Sanhedrin. And it says that we'll do according to what they tell us to do, from that place, meaning in Jerusalem, from where they meet, and we will guard to do exactly what they instruct us to do. So, again, what I summarize here is exactly what I, translated from the Hebrew text. When there are cases that are difficult or require a high level of judicial review, it is taken to Jerusalem to the Supreme Mosaic Court. What they judge is law. Okay. So the next we have from, basically the same area from Deuteronomy 17:11. It says, Al pi haTorah asher yorucho wa ala mishpot asher yomaru lecho ta'asa. So what are we supposed to do? They make a ruling, what they instruct us to do. This is from the Torah itself. Hashem, told Moshe Rabbeinu to say this. Moshe Rabbeinu is instructing the people of Israel that, whenever we go and take the, these like issues to the judges in in Jerusalem, that whatever they instruct us to do, we'll do it according to, the mishpat that they make, the judgment that they make. So the entire Israeli Jewish nation, people will perform the Torah according to the judgment of the Jerusalem Mosaic Court, the Sanhedrin. Their judgment is based on normal human reasoning of the Torah. So in order to understand this, there's something else you'd have to look at, a previous video that I made. And that video is this one here. If you look through my video list, and I'll put a link in the description of this video, you'll see a video that I had that's called Ehav Reacts to Missionaries, a video, part 5. And in this video, I specifically deal with a missionary by the name of Radar Apologetics, who at one point was having a debate with Yehudi Israel. And Radar Apologetics tries to bring up the Rambam and says that the Rambam is like misquoting the Torah. And in that video, I actually showed how Radar Apologetics either doesn't know the Mishnah Torah, never studied the Rambam, but he missed several issues that the Rambam explained. And he was misinterpreting both what the Rambam said and also misrepresenting the Rambam. And in short, essentially what it means is this. If you look in that video, I explain how the written Torah in the book of Exodus, Shemot 23:2, basically explains three different concepts. That, one, it says, Lo tiyeh aharei rabim la'ra'oth. So essentially what it explains is that when you have a judicial setting, that, you always are supposed to have an odd number of judges. And that there's never supposed to be a situation where judges will say, okay, well, this judge is greater than me. The result of what's going to happen, has a negative consequence to it. Like let's say, for example, the idea is that someone has to lose, all their money, someone has to be executed, things like that. Those are bad, those are negative results, even if it's the right decision. If a person says, if a judge says, I still have questions, they can't just say, well, I'll go along with the rabbis, every other rabbi just because they say so. It's his right, according to the Torah, to challenge what he doesn't understand. Now, when it comes down to the rulings, it says, continuing, Welo tha'aneh alo riv, So basically, if there's like an issue of some kind of argument, we're supposed to, be able to investigate it, but also, a rabbi is not supposed to look and say, okay, well, there are rabbis greater than me on this, this judicial board, this judicial setting. So I'm just going to go with what they go by. No, he has to challenge it. Even if he's proven wrong, he still has to challenge what he doesn't understand or what doesn't seem right. But at the end of the day, it says in the last part, lintoth aharei rabim lahatoth, which essentially means that we go by the majority. So for example, in the Jerusalem Sanhedrin, there were like 71 like leaders of the Jewish community that were there, rabbis, who were made up of Kohanim in most cases, Leviim, and also like different like leaders from different tribes, for example, which gave a broad representation, for example. And anytime that there's an issue, when there's a need to come to a specific judgment, which, at some point you have to come to a judgment. It can't be just up in the air and open and argued until the end of time. At some point we go by the majority. So by having an odd number of judges, you have a situation where you won't get deadlocked, for example. So I explain all that in this video, but this is important to like take into note for what's going to come forward in this particular video. This is a very important point, and if you need to like stop this video, go to the other video I showed earlier, and then go through that first before you come back to this one. I would suggest you do that now. So this brings us to the question: how do judges decide Torah cases based on the Torah? So we can again go to, Shemoth, Exodus 18:20 and also 26. Skipping in the middle, but, basically what it explains is a situation where Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu, his father-in-law sees him sitting as a judge by himself and says, hey, you need others to help you with this. You can't do this by yourself. But he tells him to find particular individuals who, are very knowledgeable and have a certain attitude about life. And then once you found those people, he says here, وَهِيز هَرَتَو أَثْهَام أَثْ هَهُگِيم وَأَثَ تُرُّث وَهُذَاتُ لَهَم أَثَ الدَّارِخ يَلَخُوهُ وَأَثْ هَمَعَسَى أَشَرْ يَعْصُونَ. Continuing, and this is the part of this is verse 26. وَشَفَتُوا أَثْ هَعَم بَخُلْ عَيْث أَثَ دَوْرْ هَغَوْشَى وَيَوِيُّونَ عَلَى مُشَى وَخُلَ دَوْرْ كَتَون يِشْبَتُون هَيْم. So what he basically explains to him is that these individuals that you will take, they'll be leaders of thousands, leaders of hundreds, and leaders of 50s and leaders of 10, and that you will enlighten them. His harto can mean to like warn, but also means to enlighten, because of the word that this three-letter root, it comes from zahar or zahir, and it says that you will enlighten them. And what do you enlighten them in? The statutes and the Toroth. Now this word Toroth is plural. You would expect in some places people say there's no oral Torah, that it would be ha-Torah, wa-etha-Torah. Here it's wa-etha-Toroth, plural. And it says, well, you will inform them, continuing of the path that they will go, in it, and, the actions to take, for example, and what they were supposed to do. And it says here that they will, basically judge the people at any time. And it says any matter that's like, very difficult, essentially that will be taken to Moshe Rabbeinu. And anything that's, like, a smaller matter, they'll handle it themselves. Now, what this means is that instruction of the Torah written oral is how judges have the background on how to make judicial rulings. There's no mention of miracles being the way to do this, for example. Now, what has to be understood is that after Moshe Rabbeinu died, the process continued with whoever was the leader of the Jewish people at that time, serving in Moshe Rabbeinu's like, place, for example. So, but in all situations after that point, the Supreme Court in Jerusalem, or before Jerusalem was established, in any place where the temple was, the Mishkan, the tabernacle was, that was the place where people would go to get the judgment of all judgments, if you will, concerning all matters that had to go above and beyond other courts. So you have in many governments, around the world, the same kind of issue where you go to a lower court to settle an issue. If it can't be settled in that court, you have the ability to raise it up at some point through a process till it gets to the highest court, and the highest court, that's it. Once they rule, that's it. And not once does the Torah say to use miracles as a way to determine how to make rulings. According to this, the instruction of the Hukim and the Toroth was enough for them to be able to go forward and make judgments. So now that we've gone through this background, let's go through this story which is in the Talmud, which is often called the Oven of Achinai, and try to understand exactly what the missionaries, are getting at about this, and also show you, for example, where they're wrong. So let's go into this story now and see what we can find in it. So starting off with, we have to kind of go through this bit by bit. And I had to break this down into different parts because the story can be very complex for someone who doesn't understand Hebrew, Aramaic, and also the context of the Talmud itself. So the starting off with, we have the very beginning of the story where it says, Thanan Hothom, Hothocho, Huloyoth, Wanothan Hol, Ben Huloyo, Lehuloyo, Rabbi Eliezer, Metaher, Wahachomim, Metahin. So essentially what this tells is the following. This is a judicial case concerning, different technologies of ovens. And an oven in this case concerns and the issue is whether it, imparts ritual impurity, meaning that, for example, someone having an oven that can actually transmit ritual impurity might be in a situation, if they don't know it or if they think that it can't, where they go to the temple and they're ritually impure and that they're not supposed to be in the temple during that time. So there has to be a judicial decision during this period about whether this particular, group of, situations, whether it's something that's, perfectly fine, it doesn't impart ritual impurity, or whether it doesn't. And this situation, what we're told is that Rabbi Eliezer, who is, going to be a major character in this particular story, is saying that, it's, perfectly fine, it doesn't, transmit ritual impurity, where the rest of the Sanhedrin is saying that it does. A judicial decision has to be made concerning this issue because it was brought to the Sanhedrin and they are the in line for these kind of questions. So if we continue with what the Gemara tells us, it says, "Wazehu tanur shel Achinai, ma Achinai, Omar Rav Yehuda, Omar Shmuel, shehi kifu levorim she'Achinai zeh, v'titma'uhu." Okay, so if we look at the beginning of this, what it's essentially telling us is that this is a judicial case concerning some technology, and oven in this case concerning impurity, and what it basically deals with whether this particular oven can impart ritual impurity, yes or no, which is an important thing for the Sanhedrin to be able to rule upon, because this is a practical application scenario. This part continues. Well, the story says, "Ba'otho hayom hashiv ribi Eliezer kol teshuvot sheba'olam v'lo kibelu hamenu." So I'll start with just this first part, where it starts about here. If you can see my mouse, I'll get the pointer on. And I started reading from here all the way to here. Now, what it basically states is that Rabbi Eliezer, who was a part of the Sanhedrin, is making a bunch of group of arguments that we talked about earlier about the fact that this particular oven, in his view, doesn't impart ritual impurity, and he gives all kind of answers to it. But what he's saying is not received by the Sanhedrin, meaning that they're in a judicial process, and he's making trying to make his particular position the ruling that they go by. But his ruling, is not accepted by everyone else. So they have a different ruling that they're going to want to go by. And again, the majority rules here. So he's, making this position. And then it continues and says, starting right here, it says, Amar. Okay, so there it says, Amar lahem, im halachok mothi, haruv ze yochiach. And then it continues, it says, Na'akar haruv mekomokomo me'o amo, wa amri lo arba me'oth amo. So what it says here is essentially that he responds to them and says, if the halacha is like, what I'm saying, essentially, this hiruv tree, will, basically prove it. And then it says that, essentially, according to the story, that the haruv tree uprooted itself and moved 100 amah. And then there are some who say that it actually moved 400 amah, 400 amah. So that's like, amah is like a measure of distance, for example. So essentially what it says is, what I've said here, is that he essentially says, okay, well, if the halakha is like me, then this tree will move, and then for example, that proves, or basically says, well, the tree will prove it to me, and the tree supposedly moves. Okay, so now starting off, you have to start to question, okay, do you really believe that this actually happened? Maybe it did, but then you have to question, okay, well, now we're getting into some areas where we're starting to see something like a tree moving on its own, 100 amah, would have to be essentially described as a miracle, because that's not something that normally happens as far as we understand nature to work. So now we have to go to what the response was to this particular situation happening. And it says here, Amrulo, meaning that the other, the other members of the Sanhedrin, if you will, the other, group of them, it says, Amrulo en mevi'im ra'aya min ha'haruf. So essentially saying, we don't determine halakha based upon a tree, you know. So, it's like saying, okay, well, there's no evidence from the Torah that tells us that we have to go by these kind of things happening in order to say we're going to make a ruling. Because essentially, if you look at what Rabbi Eliezer basically said, he just says the Chayrut should prove it, and it's like, okay, well, that happened, something happened, but that's not how we determine halakha, and we'll get, and again, that's based on the Torah itself, and we'll see at the end where that's proven out. So then the story continues and says, Hazar wa amar lahem im halachok amothi amath hamayim yochichu. So essentially, what he says is that if the Torah is like me, if the ruling is supposed to be like me, if the halacha is supposed to be like what I'm saying, then this, basically this path of water will prove it. And it says Hasuru amat hamayim la'ahorahem. So it basically says like the water, like went the opposite direction. And Rabbi Eliezer responded back to them, said that the halakha is to be ruled in favor of his claim. A river flowing, a flowing body of water will reverse direction, and the water changed direction. Okay. Now the story continues in the following way. That essentially makes this question. Okay, well, what will be the response to that? And it says, Amrulo en mivi'in ra'ayo ma'amath hamoim. So essentially, what the rest of the Sanhedrin responds is, that we don't bring evidence for a halakha ruling based on a river reversing direction, and that's based on the Torah. The Torah doesn't tell us to make rulings in this way, based on like river, changing direction, So then we continue even further, and it says that essentially, that there was a response from Rabbi Eliezer, and it says, Chazar o Amar lahem im alochokamoti kotolei bet amidrash yochihu. So essentially, he says that if the halacha is like me, or according to what I'm saying, that essentially the walls of the Bet Midrash will prove it. And it says, Hitu kotolei bet midrash lepol ga'ar, and it says, lepol. So essentially, what it says here is that he's saying that if the halakha is like what I'm saying, these walls will basically fall over, and the walls began to kind of like basically tip over. Continues, and it says Ga'ar bahem Rabbi Yehoshua Amar lahem im talmidei hachomim minasachim ze at ze b'halacho atem ma tivchem לא נפלו מפני כבודו של רבי יהושע ולא זקפו ממני כבודו מכבוד של רבי אליעזר ועדיין מתים ועומדים. So here it brings up a really interesting point in the story. So essentially before the walls fall down, Rabbi Yehoshua, who was on the Sanhedrin, basically rebukes the walls and says, if the students of, of the Chachamim, if we have learned the Torah from the Chachamim who came before us, are arguing or, about the halakha, it's like saying, what is your involvement in this matter? What is it good for you that, to get involved in this argument? And then it says that when he rebuked the walls, they didn't, fall, because of him, but they also didn't like fully go back and, to the place that they were from before, in respect to Rabbi Eliezer. And, that they basically, were still standing, but not fully the way they were before. So then this brings up an interesting point, that I mentioned to when I was dealing with a Karaite on this issue, that if we look at this, we see that, if we want to accept this story as historically fact, then we have to say, okay, well, there's something here that tells us that whatever Rabbi Eliezer was, doing, it wasn't absolute. Meaning that if he, it's not like he's a Navi, the Torah, this Talmud is not claiming him to be a Navi. But we already see that, if he says the walls are supposed to, prove it, but they don't fully come down, that means the walls didn't prove it. If they're able to go back up, even if it's partially. So we see here that we have an interesting point in this. And again, if you continue, this will get even interesting, especially when we get to the end point. So then if we look further in the story, it says, Chazar wa Amar lahem, and this is meaning Rabbi Eliezer, it says, Im halacha kamothi, Mina Shemaim Yachihu. And it says that, if, the halakha is like what I'm saying, according to my view, then, that meaning Hashemaim, meaning, if you will, the powers of heaven, if you will, will prove it. And it says, Yasato, Bo Kol wa Amaro, Ma Lachem Etzel Rabbi Eliezer Shalacho Kamoto. So essentially it says that, Rabbi Eliezer says, if the halakha is like me, Shemaim will, prove it. And then it says that, there was a bat kol that, spoke and said, like, basically, like, what are you guys arguing with Rabbi Eliezer for? The halakha is like him. So this brings up an, interesting issue. that we mentioned before in the previous one, the walls began to fall, but now we have a situation where he's like calling upon Shemaim to prove his point. So if we continue with the next part of the story, then it says, continue on. Kama Amad Ribi Yahushua al Rakalov, Ve'amar Lo b'shamayim hi, and this is from the Devarim Lamed, Lo b'shamayim hi, Amar Ribi Yemiryo, Shekavar Natana Torah Bahar Sinai, En Anu Mashgihain, Bevat Kol, Shekavar Katavta Bahar Sinai, Betorah Shemot Kaf Gimel, Acharei Rabim Lahatot. So essentially, the response that Rabbi Yehoshua gives to this is that the Torah is not in the heavens, and this is he quotes from the book of Deuteronomy 30, Devarim 30, and it says Lo b'shamayim hi, and this is something that Moshe Rabbeinu explained from the Creator of all things, that the Torah is not in the Shemaim, and the verse, if you continue in that part of the Torah in the verse, it says that we don't need someone to go up into the heavens to get the Torah and bring it down to us to explain to us how to do it. We don't need someone to go across the sea to explain us how to do it, that the wisdom of how to do the Torah is amongst the people of Israel. And that's where it says, here's that Rabbi Yemirya basically says that the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai. And we don't need a bat kol to try to tell us how to do, how the creator of all things had already given the Torah. And because the Torah already states in Shemot, Exodus 23, Ahar Rabim Lahatoth. Now remember, I brought that up earlier, meaning that we go after the majority. The Torah already explained this to be the case. So the issue here is the following: if Hashem gave the Torah at Mount Sinai, explained how to do the judicial rulings, explained the format from which judicial rulings are made, and if Hashem made it clear that we go after the majority in cases that are not clear or cases where there's a disagreement, we don't need something coming down from the heavens, as the Torah tells us we don't need it to explain how to do the will of Hashem in this case, because Hashem already gave it. So I look at this from I take an outside perspective on this. On one level, I can say, well, how do we know this bat kol was Hashem speaking? Because it's called a bat kol. It's not called specifically, and Hashem said blah blah blah. But I mean, anybody can say a bat kol spoke to me, or we could say, well, maybe we don't understand what we even heard. But even still, why did Hashem give the Torah and tell us to rule in these matters the way that He did, and then come back later and reverse that into something else? Hashem wouldn't do that. So that's one of the issues that I would say, looking at this, we get out of this part of it, that what their answer is that, look, we're not, going against the will of Hashem. Hashem already gave His will in the Torah and gave us the format which we're using to make these judicial rulings. He never told us to do the things that Rabbi Eliezer is doing in order to prove a point in terms of Jewish law. So then what we have to do is continue in the story. And the story tells us in the following, and essentially what it says is that, okay, this is like, after this point, and it's basically explaining, Ashgahe, Ribi Yonathan Eliyahu, Amar le, Ma Aved Kudosho, Berichu Behahi Sha'atho. Amar le, Kohich, wa Amar, Nisahoni Banai, Nisahoni Banai. So essentially what this means is that according to the story, Hashem, basically agreed with the ruling. It says that, the Ribi Natan Eliyahu, Rabbi Natan, essentially, it's like he passes away after this happens. And that essentially, what happens is that the Creator of all things says, concerning this whole story of this, Oven of Achanai, Bani. Sorry, I'm missing that point. But essentially what it says is that, the Creator of all things, says that, if you will, that, my children have, if you will, I guess you could say one against me, or nisahoni would be like saying that they've bested me in some way, and essentially what it's saying is that the Creator of all things agreed with their ruling. Now again, it's using flowery language to say that that's the point, but essentially the point is being made is that the Creator of all things is saying that my children, the people of Israel, the judicial setting, they're using the Torah as I gave it. They've excelled. Because the thing that the Torah tells us at one point is that the Creator of all things will test the Jewish people to make sure we love them. Now there are some people who misunderstand that to mean that the Creator of all things is testing Israel for him to see something. When instead the Jewish understanding is the Creator of all things is testing us so that we see something. So what this basically tells us here is that the Creator of all things approved of their ruling because it went by the Torah, and that they did exactly what the Hashem wanted by going by the Torah, and not going by signs and wonders and all that stuff to make judicial rulings. So now we get to the question, what can we learn from this story? Is it really a story that's telling us that the rabbis are saying that they have the right to go against what the creator of all things ruled? Or is it trying to tell us that the rabbis are saying we're doing the process that Hashem gave already, and that we don't go by miracles and all that kind of stuff to try to prove out a legal case? That's not the way that the Torah gave us to do judicial rulings. So let's look at that and see in more detail exactly what is the Talmud saying in this case. Is it really as simple as just looking at this one section and saying, well, this is what it is? So let's look again. Okay, we asked the question, can Jewish courts overrule Hashem? And the reality is that no, a Jewish court cannot overrule Hashem. The Jewish court in this story was doing exactly what Hashem gave in the written Torah. The written Torah. So, for those who try to say, well, Jews have this oral Torah and that we're not doing what the written Torah says, this is the story that says, hey, the written Torah already told us how to do it, so we're doing what the written Torah says. The next question we have is, does the Torah require miracles in judicial settings? No. There's no place in the Torah that it requires the shoftim or the shotorim, the judges and the officers, to go and look for some kind of miracle in order to figure out how to make a judicial ruling. It says they're supposed to already have been taught the Torah and the halakha from those of previous generations, and then they perform it based upon what was given. And then the other issue is, what is a bat kol? In this particular section, it doesn't fully explain it, but that's another question you'd have to ask if you want to really address this issue. And then the other issue is this story historical or is it Agadah? Now, here's what I find interesting, that looking at this from the missionary perspective. So some missionaries go through this and say, aha, you see, this story is saying that the rabbis can overrule Hashem. This brings up the question, are you saying that the story is literal? Is it in a historical statement? Because if it is, then you have to take every section of the story, including the part where Hashem said, my children have done the will of Hashem by doing what the written Torah says. Rather than going by all these miracles and things like that, or what appears to be some kind of miracle, which, as we said before, weren't absolute, or they weren't absolute, meaning that as soon as the part of the walls came up, the wall started falling down, but as soon as Rabbi Yehoshua started saying what he said, the walls went back up, and they never fully went back to where they were in respect to, Rabbi Eliezer, but they also didn't completely fall down in respect to Rabbi Yehoshua, meaning that this was not some absolute miracle scenario. And even if we say, okay, well, the river will prove it. A river goes backwards. Well, what exactly does that mean? And then you have to, a tree moves, 100 amma. Really? Can trees do that? And under what circumstances do they do it? What if the tree was doing it anyway? These are the questions you'd have to ask. But again, we don't have to ask it. We know the Torah, the written Torah, tells us it doesn't tell us to make judgments in this way. And that's the issue that was at play here. That Rabbi Eliezer, because they didn't agree with him, went to this level, and that's one of the things that this particular story is getting at. And we'll see in just a second that the story is going above and beyond this in terms of what its really big issue is. That's a very important point before I get to some of the major details about this story that are missed usually when it's discussed. And I want to deal with the dishonesty of missionaries about this story. And I think this is something that I don't know if enough people have really addressed. Okay, so what is the dishonesty I'm talking about? Missionaries, if you really, really want to get to what missionaries are about, and if you listen to what they say, the missionaries disagree with both Rabbi Eliezer and the entire Sanhedrin. What do I mean by that? According to missionaries, Rabbi Eliezer's position is just as invalid as the rest of the Sanhedrin. Think about it. If you think about what the New Testament says about, for example, legalism and things like that, and you can find it, you can find it in different videos. So there's a big thing within the Christian, various Christian movements that basically says that, Jews are legalistic and the Pharisees and the Sadducees were legalistic, and all this kind of stuff. So think about, again, what is the disagreement about? It's about a legal issue, in this story. So this would mean that if let's say that Rabbi Eliezer's position was accepted, well, the missionaries would still have a problem because they still say that this whole system is legalistic and the way the Jews are doing things is incorrect. It's not what the creator of all things wanted. And you can look at a number of videos that are put out there by Christians that say the same thing about this, and that the Jews were getting so legalistic and observing the Old Testament and things like that. This is something that you can find all over the place. So I think that this is one thing that I don't think has been addressed enough. That at the end of the day, the missionaries don't agree with Rabbi Eliezer. They don't respect him in any way. Because at the end of the day, his position is against their position also. He wasn't a believer in Jesus in any way, and he didn't support any of the ideas that the New Testament claims about the Torah or against the Torah. He definitely wasn't a follower of Paul. So we can easily say that really the issue is not about whether or not the rabbis were against Rabbi Eliezer or what he was saying or the bat kol or anything like that. The basic position of the missionary is that all of these guys were wrong, and that if you will, ask them this question. Any missionary who wants to quote this story to you, say, hey, did a bat kol really speak because Rabbi Eliezer supposedly was right? Because if he was right, then that means that the Creator of all things was dealing with the people of Israel, was dealing with the Sanhedrin, and that the Creator of all things was willing to say that they were right about what they said. And that's what goes into the whole idea. Are you then saying that this story is historical? Or are you saying that this is a historical story that happened from start to finish exactly as it's written in the Talmud? Because the minute you say that, then you have to say, well, the last part about what Hashem said is also historical, and that Hashem agreed that the Sanhedrin was right for what they did. And an important point that has to be made here is that one of the things that's brought out about the story is that in some light, essentially Rabbi Eliezer was right in the ruling, for example, but that the issue was is that the Sanhedrin was making what's called a gezerah. And a gezerah is a particular legal terminology to mean that this is something that we're making a ruling on, where we're essentially saying that we want to say that this action is something that we don't do, so that people won't fail in other areas where they can be confused. Because again, if you say that this is new technology that people don't quite understand it, it's easy for someone to make the assumption that if this oven is considered to be not doesn't carry ritual impurity, then they may say an oven that actually does is the same thing, so therefore it must also be. And the Torah gives the right to the Sanhedrin to make rulings, for the Jewish people to say, okay, here's some circumstances that we will do these things. Even if the Torah doesn't say we don't do it, the Torah gave the judges the ability to make rulings. So a good example of that is that the Torah talks about not mixing milk and meat together. And it does it in a way of metaphor. But, the Torah never says, for example, to not mix chicken and milk together, because of course chickens don't produce milk. But we Jews don't eat chicken and milk together. Why? Not because the Torah says so. It's because at a certain point there was a Sanhedrin that made a ruling because of the time that they lived in, and that we continue to follow, and democratically we can choose to continue to follow, and says, okay, well, we know that chickens don't produce milk, and we know that there's not a problem from the Torah for milk and chicken, but because of the fact that someone can kind of wiggle their way back to like saying, okay, well, meat and milk are not also forbidden, because of the fact that chicken is meat and I can, eat chicken and milk, why not? So a ruling was made that we won't eat chicken and milk together. And again, the Torah says you can make rulings like that if you're the judicial system in a Torah-based nation. And we Jews have democratically said, well, we're going to continue to hold by this. Now, if one thing that halakha does allow, if a greater Sanhedrin says that there's a ruling made by a previous Sanhedrin, and this Sanhedrin that's here now is greater than the previous one, they can say, okay, that ruling that they made, we can, overturn that ruling because of several reasons. Like, for example, one reason is that nobody's following it, or the reason could be that, it's not valid, but it has to be a Sanhedrin that's greater than the previous one. And this is only in cases where it's not contradicting something in the Torah. So now we get to the big point here. The main point of this story that I don't think is covered enough. So again, you've probably gotten tired of me showing this particular thing here, this particular picture, because again, this is a picture of the kind of the structure of the oven here, and I could call this Achinai because of the fact that it kind of curves around almost like a snake, and that's one of the reasons it's called that. So what is the real point of the entire story? Is it really about whether the rabbis have the right to overrule Hashem? Is it really about like who's right and who's wrong about this oven? Well, one of the things we learn from the Mishnah itself is the basic point is knowing how to properly address someone with words in various situations. And I'll show in just a second how that's, correctly to be understood. So one of the things we find is that if we go into the Mishnah, which the Mishnah precedes the part of the Talmud that we've been reading so far, and often when you go to the Mishnah, it gives you an idea of what exactly is going to be discussed, in the areas of the Gemara, which we were reading from previously. So the Mishnah tells us the following, starting from here, from reading Hebrew from right to left, and it says, "Kashem she'ono b'mikoch u'mikor koch ono b'devorim לא יאמר לו מחמו חפץ זה, והוא אינו רוצה לכך. אם הוא בעל תשובו, לא יאמר לו זכור מעשיך הראשונים, אם הוא בן גרים, לא יאמר לו זכור מעשה אבותיך, שנאמר וגר לא תונה, ולא תלחצנו." So essentially, what this particular Mishnah is talking about, it's talking about this idea, of someone, for example, who's selling something, and making, potential person, kind of like feel bad, with their words about, buying it or not buying it, for example. Another issue is that someone who made return to the Torah, let's say someone didn't grow up, in the Torah community, and then they return to the Torah, or someone who left the Torah and came back. We don't go to them and say, okay, remember what you used to do? Remember before you kept the Torah, who you used to be and what you used to be about? And we don't go to someone who converted to the Torah and say, remember how your fathers used to act? Remember all that stuff? And the Torah tells us not to do that to like someone who's converting. So this is the Mishnah. The Mishnah precedes the part that we read of the Gemara, and everything after, in some level, deals with this idea of how do we address people with our words, because we know that words can hurt. And we know that words can basically destroy a person. And that's exactly what this is getting at. And we'll see in just a second why that is in relation to the story of Rabbi Eliezer and the Sanhedrin. So if we go back to the Gemara and we actually look and say, okay, what is the after effects of this particular story? And essentially the after effects that are mentioned in this story, it says, starting here at the beginning, and I'll just read through this whole thing and then I'll kind of go through and explain it. It says, אותו היום הביאו כל הטהרות שהיתר רבי אליעזר ושרופום באש, ונמנו עליו יברכוהו, ואמרו, מי ילך וידעו? And then it continues, says, אמר להם רבי עקיבא, אני אלך, שמה ילך אדם שאינו הורון וידעו, ונמצא מחריב את כל העולם כולו. מה עשה רבי עקיבא? לבש שחורים ונתעטף שחורים. וישב לפניו ברחוק 400 אמות. אמר לו רבי אליעזר עקיבא, מה היום מיומיים? אמר לו, רבי כי דומה לי שחברים בדילים ממך. אף הוא גרע בגדיו וחלץ מנעליו ונשמט וישב על גבי גרבו. זלגו עיניו דמעות. לגו לעולם שליש בזיתים ושליש בחיטים ושליש בשעורים. So essentially, what is this telling us? This tells us that after all of the events that are mentioned there, that essentially what the Sanhedrin had to go do is to basically, destroy the different ovens that, basically that Rabbi Eliezer had, basically said, did not transmit ritual impurity, because they made a ruling. And they had to make sure that people were able to hold by the ruling and not be confused by, what had already been out there. So essentially, they had to kind of go and destroy those ovens to make sure that nobody would go and try to use them, in that way, or like the Sorofotam. And then essentially what it says is that, okay, well, somebody has to go and talk to Rabbi Eliezer. And the reason why is because of the fact that, essentially the Talmud in a nice way says, essentially that he was kind of sanctioned, because of, the I guess the path that he took in the argument. So essentially, what happens is that Rabbi, Kiva says that, he'll go do it. He's like, because, essentially, it's like saying, I know him, and it needs to be someone who has the right understanding of how to approach him and the position that he's in to let him know that, he's been sanctioned. And generally speaking, these kind of sanctions were like 30 days, especially if the person was willing to accept it. So it's no different than judges now. There are situations where judges now get sanctioned. And in many cases, if it's not like a big issue, they may be sanctioned for a period of time. They may have to say, okay, I make an apology, for the way that I handled this particular circumstance. And then they get back to the bench and then they keep going from there. So it says that Rabbi Akiva went to Rabbi Eliezer and he was dressed in black. And he sat, like a distance of 4 amot away from him, and Rabbi Eliezer asked him, well, why, what's going on here? What's the deal? And basically Rabbi Akiva talks to him in a way that kind of nicely lets him know that he's been sanctioned. And that's when it says Rabbi Eliezer, basically tore his garments and, kind of, took on the actions of someone who's been sanctioned. And, essentially, it's like saying, okay, well, the deal, the situation's been done, life goes on. And, eventually, life just goes on. But the basic issue that this particular story is saying is for this point here, that even after all of that stuff, the basic issue is that, we have to let him know that he's been sanctioned, but it has to be done by the right person with the right words, because the words of a person can destroy him. We're not trying to destroy him. We're trying to kind of let him know what, the point of the Torah, that even the Creator agreed with according to the story. So this is an important point that I think most of the time is left out. That the whole point of that whole story deals with building up, this whole scenario and then saying, okay, well, we don't want to break the man. Someone has to go to him and talk to him in a way till it doesn't break him, it doesn't destroy his world. because of the fact that he's been sanctioned. And there are situations where a judge would have to be sanctioned. This is normal society. And the Torah is not, like I say, some, whimsical, like mystical religious thing, where people just kind of like la 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 get along. There are times where, serious situations have to be dealt with seriously. And the whole point of this to say, going back to the Mishnah, that we have to be careful of the words we use to talk to people. We don't want to make them feel horrible because of the situation. Now, again, someone can say, well, his response, seems to be horrible. No, but I mean, that's going to be anybody's response when they're sanctioned. I mean, any judge who gets sanctioned, even in modern society, he's not going to be happy about it. But, you deal with it, you take on the role, and life goes on. And you learn from that, and you come back, and then people welcome you back with open arms, especially in a circumstance like this. But the issue is that the Torah explained to us exactly how to make these kind of rulings, and it wasn't based upon the kind of miracles that were being pushed out there. The Torah tells us exactly what to do with it. So let's relate this to like what some missionaries claim, that the whole point of this story is to be a sanction against Jesus himself, to say, well, Jesus did miracles, therefore what they're trying to say is that you can't rely on Jesus and things like that. The story has nothing to do with Jesus at all. Literally, there's nothing here that deals with Jesus and miracles, because the bigger issues that I've mentioned in other videos, there's no evidence that Jesus did any of those miracles that are claimed in the New Testament. I mean, again, the New Testament is written in Greek. It's not written in a Jewish language. And, the evidence, if you say, okay, well, what Jews saw any of these miracles? Where are they? What are their names? The only thing I get out of people when I ask this question is, oh, well, there were 13 witnesses. Oh, wait, well, like the disciples, there's only like 4 gospels. There's no evidence that any of the gospel writers, that of the gospels that exist today, that the actual text itself was written by the people who supposedly, are claimed in the New Testament. There's no evidence in a Jewish perspective for that. I mean, there should be lots of gospels. If there were like thousands of Jews who saw these things, there should be thousands of Jews who joined the Jewish, the Jewish Christian movement, and it should still be going like strong by now. It should be bigger than anything else. But it died out within 2 generations, and according to some Christian sources, as I pointed in other videos, they say that it became heretical, even according to Christianity, within 2 generations. So this tells us something. And again, if you're a Christian listening to this, and you're listening to missionaries telling you this stuff, you have to ask yourself, what is their angle for this? Especially when you look at the Ashmez guys who was saying, like why Christians should be concerned about it. Really? I mean, this story has been around for like more than 1,000 years, and all of a sudden now you should be concerned about it? No. Number one. Number two, the people who try to bring this up don't go through and try to show you the whole story of it to begin with. And even still, it basically proves the point of what some Christians try to call sola scriptura. That essentially the whole point, the one point, that the Sanhedrin makes against Rabbi Eliezer is that the written Torah tells us how to deal with these issues. We don't go by miracles because the written Torah doesn't tell us to expect miracles to deal with this stuff. And again, if you're saying that this story is literally true, that means that Rabbi Eliezer had the power to do things greater than what even Jesus did, if you will. Because all that stuff is like way, and this is a source that's accepted by Jews all over the world, Torah-based Jews. There's no Torah-based Jews who can look back and say, my ancestors were in Jerusalem and they saw the stuff that Jesus did and we have evidence of it. There's no claim like that from any Jewish community. No ancient Jewish community has anyone claiming that they saw the stuff that Jesus did. So the story has nothing to do with Jesus. And different Christians have different ideologies about even like what you can consider to be what was the historical, Jesus even like. I once met a missionary in Israel who tried to claim that Rabbi Eliezer was actually Jesus. That the Talmud is like supposedly recording, like by the name Rabbi Eliezer. He claimed that he believed that that was Jesus actually in reality. So again, this stuff can go all over, off the walls, so to speak, when it comes to missionaries and what their points are. So I would tell you, if you are, a Jew who's listening to this, and you don't know Hebrew, you don't know Aramaic, learn the languages for yourself so that you don't get fooled. So I've got other videos that deals with like the proof for what rabbinical Jews hold by. If you want to use that title, I have like a number of videos that you can go into playlist and I'll include that here. So this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and again, don't take my word for it just because I say it. I've shown you what the Talmud actually says, and I've broken down the language behind it and what it means, and also from the Torah. Do your own research. Don't trust me, just like you shouldn't trust the missionaries. Do your own research. Go to your family. The Torah tells you specifically, go to your fathers, go to the zakanim of your community, go to the elders of your community that your Jewish family came from. Ask them. If they don't, if what the missionary is saying doesn't match the Torah that they received, you have to say no. So thank you and bye.